welcome to Classical Theology. We are going through The Concept of God by Ronald Nash and looking at various divine attributes. And today we are looking at chapter 2, the concepts of God, or two concepts of God. And he's going to look at two different conceptions here. And this reminds me of something that Norman Geisler used to say in class. He said one time at least that there are only really two views of God: the classical Thomistic view and process theology. And I wonder if you got that from Ronald Nash, because Nash says that here in this chapter. If you've never heard of process theology, then we're going to learn about that today. I'm also going to throw in a couple of other groups that are similar in some ways anyway, namely open theism and what's now referred to in some circles as theistic personalism. But let's first look at Thomistic theism, or what also could be called classical theism. And that is what I would say, the orthodox, traditional, historical view of God. And he gives on page 20, looks like 8 different characteristics that would make you Thomistic or classical. And one, normally there's 4. Let me just go through these 8 here. One is pure actuality. And if you remember from a few sessions ago, we talked about pure actuality from the first argument for God's existence according to Thomas Aquinas. And that is the view that if God is not put together of potentiality and actuality, then he's pure act. And that's what Norm meant when he said there are really just two views of God. One is the view that God is pure act with no potentiality whatsoever. And the other view is that God is composed of both act and potency. So, this is why I would argue that many other views are more similar to process theology, and we'll see why, because they also hold that God is composed or has the aspects of act and potency, or the ability to change. Because if God has no potency, then he can't change. So one characteristic of classical theism or Thomistic theology is pure actuality. Another, if he doesn't have potentiality, he's immutable or unchangeable. That just follows naturally from God being pure act. The number 2 is immutability or unchanging, being unchangeable. And the third, which is a kind of a subset of being unchangeable, is the notion of God being impassible. So divine impassibility is the notion that God is not affected or passive in any way. If he's pure act, then he has no aspect of his being that is passive. He's not affected. He doesn't have passions or emotions like humans do. So he is different in that regard. He is impassible. Nothing that happens affects him in any way. And that's oftentimes misunderstood to mean that God doesn't care or is unrelatable or something like that. And that's just not the case at all. And when we look more at immutability down the road, we'll look and at that aspect in more depth and try to hopefully clarify some confusion there. But we'll look at that more when we get to immutability. The fourth point or characteristic that classical or Thomistic philosophers or theologians hold to is timelessness. I would call that eternal. Bill Craig is well known for holding that God is timeless when he says sans creation or without creation, but he's temporal, quote unquote, after creation. So, but for God to be eternal in the classical sense means that he's not the kind of being to have a past, present, and future, even with creation. So, in fact, the chapter on that is called, when we get to chapter 6, eternity, it's called that. It's called eternity. The fifth attribute, I don't know why he puts this fifth, it should be the second, is simplicity. And that's the idea. We've already discussed this in previous episodes, is that God is not composed of parts. And then necessity, number 6, that God is a necessary being, meaning that he cannot fail to exist. He must exist necessarily because he's not put together of parts, so he just necessarily exists of himself and through himself, which leads to another attribute that's not listed here called divine aseity. A S E I T Y, the divine aseity. And that is the notion that God is ase, a new word, se, from Latin, through oneself or through himself. That is, that he is completely independent of anything else. He is God by himself and does not need anything else. After necessity is number 7, omniscience, that God is all-knowing. We'll look at that and see what that means down the road. What does it mean to be all-knowing? Can God not know the future and still be all-knowing? Open theists will say yes, so we will look at that in a few chapters down the road. And then number 8, omnipotence, that God is all-powerful. What does it mean for God to be all-powerful? The definitions of these terms actually are disputed among theologians, and we'll look and see how they define these terms and what's meant by them and what they think about God being these or having these attributes or characteristics. Now, so that's the Thomistic view. That's the classical view that I hold to, and it is the classical view that Jesus held to. I think so, anyway. But we're going to look at the other one. Again, the reason I like this book is because it does talk about the other views. So it lets us juxtapose them together and look at supposed objections and problems with the classical view, which I think is good to dispel misconceptions as well as to be able to look at objections and make the views more clear. Okay. So Nash has a discussion here. I'm not going to cover this right now about Aristotle. You can read this if you want to, and I do recommend, if you're wanting to go through the study, go ahead and read the book. It's a really it's a really short book. It's only 120 or so pages, not even actually. It looks like 115 pages, and I'll have a link to it in the description if you want to get this book. It is an affiliate link, but it's a good book. It's clear. It gives a good overview of these attributes. They don't really agree with Nash on everything, but that doesn't mean it's not a good book. It's a good book for the purpose that I think is for, which is just learning about the different views. And so to do that, you want a book that's going to go over the different views. So that's the overall view of classical theism. Now I'll turn over to page 22 and look at process theology, which is pretty much the opposite of everything that we just saw in classical theism. So a classical theist will think that process theology is
just plain evil.
Okay, I just had to push that button. I've never had a chance to do it before. So there you go. There's my new toy. Well, classical theologians will think that process theology is just wrong anyway, as will process theologians think that about Thomism or classical theology. Now, on page 24, he gives another list, a little bit different in terms of how he writes it out, but another list of what process theology thinks. Now, process theology is named that because it is thought to be that God is in a process. So process theology really goes back to Alfred North Whitehead, who was born during the Civil War, 1861, right around, I'm not sure exactly what month it was, but around 1861, the beginning of the Civil War, and died, I believe, 1947, so just after World War II, so saw a lot, or lived through a lot in his life. But he is the father of process theology, which is the idea that God is in a process of changing and becoming. And as Nash says in this chapter, classical theology focuses on the being of God, God being pure, infinite existence, whereas process theology focuses on God becoming perfect. So whereas in classical theology, God is perfect, in process theology, God is in a process of becoming more actual and more perfect. So one aspect of this view of theology on page 24, number 1, it says in process theology, Thomistic theism's emphasis upon being is replaced with its own stress upon becoming. That's the main thrust of process theology, is that process theologians, as well as open theists who think that they have a lot in common here, but not exactly the same with process theologians. Open theists think that the future is open to God. That's why it's called open theism or openness theology. But they have some things in common, namely that they don't like classical theism's dependence or influence by classical Greek philosophy, such as Plato and Aristotle. They think that it's wrong to imbibe classical, quote unquote, pagan ideas into Christian theology. And they also want to make God more relational. We'll see that as we go along. Number 2, while the God of Christian theism is an independent creator, the God of process theology is an interdependent cooperator. So process theologians will deny, and there may be outliers where someone may be a process theologian and doesn't agree with everything, as Nash says here. There are some differences of opinion. But by and large, process theologians will eschew or not hold to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creation from nothing. Rather, they will maintain that the universe is somehow an active. The universe is God's potential whole, and God himself is the active pole. So there's an active and passive side, or active and potential side of God, and this view also is called panentheism. So pan meaning the Greek word all, and then en just meaning the word in. So all in, and theism, God. And this is different from pantheism, which is all is God. In pantheism, everything is God. You're God, I'm God, my desk is God, the cows outside down the street are God, the trees, everything is identical with God. In panentheism, nature isn't identical with God, but God is in nature. God is in nature very much like a soul is in a body. So God is not a creator in process theology like he is in classical theology. He's more of a cooperator and a fashioner, as it were. I did my doctoral dissertation on a philosopher named Richard Creel, who wanted to kind of split the path between a Thomistic view of God and a process view of God. And that was especially in relation to divine impassibility. So when we get into that area, I'll have more to say about my work there. But he wanted to kind of make a third way, middle way, really, between Charles Hartshorne, who was influenced by Whitehead, and Thomas Aquinas. So a thinker who was a process theologian and a thinker who was classical. And that was in particular in relation to divine impassibility. But there was a lot there in Creel regarding creation, because he said it doesn't make sense to say that God creates from nothing, because that is incoherent. He must create from something. The something that Creel talks about is he calls the plenum, Plenu, and the plenum, which is a repository of an infinite amount of potentiality that God can pull from and create from. And without that, God wouldn't be God. So there's a dependence on the plenum for God to even be God. So you can see this kind of active and potential whole there. And the book by Creel, if you're interested, is called Divine Impassibility, an Essay in Philosophical Theology. All right. The third point here for process theology is that the classical Christian doctrine of divine immutability is replaced by the notion of a changing God. So God's always in a process of becoming. He is becoming more and more actual. Number 4, in the writings of some process thinkers, the personal God of theism appears to be replaced by an impersonal God. And as he goes on to say here, that's not always the case with these process thinkers. There's some are more see God more as personal, some see him as more impersonal. Number 5, process theologians unanimously reject the timelessness doctrine of Thomistic theism. And it's not just Thomistic theism, this is whole also to other thinkers as well, Augustine, Anselm, and the orthodox position historically in the church that God is not in time. So for process theologians, as well as open theists, and I would throw in theistic personalists, we'll get to there in a little bit later, God is indeed somehow in the temporal order or is in time, therefore he's not eternal. They think that it's quote unquote a self contradiction to think of God as both alive and changeless, end quote. So to say that God is a person requires him to be relatable and changing and all like that. And that'll be very similar again to open theists and theistic personalists. Theistic personalists, in case you're wondering, is just the idea that God is a person very much like you and me. And that how we think of him and describe him needs to be very much like how we think about ourselves. And so we mentioned before in kind of the intro to all these attributes that there are different ways our language can track or apply to God. Univocally, which means our language is the same between us and God. Equivocally, which means it's completely different. And then analogically, which means it's somewhat the same and somewhat different. So a theistic personalist would think that our language, much like I think a process theologian, at least sometimes, and an open theist for sure, that our language is univocal as it describes, takes an attribute and has the same meaning for us and for God. And then number 6, while both theists and pantheists describe God as perfect representatives of the two movements, understand perfection in significantly different ways. So perfection for a process thinker means that God is in a state of becoming more and more actual, more and more perfect. And that very process in itself is something good and perfect. That it's better to be in this kind of state of becoming. Whereas in classical theology, God is always in a state of actuality and infinite being and can't change. He can't become more perfect. Number 7, theists and pantheists disagree as to whether God should be understood as absolute or relative. Relative to what, for example? What is he? Is he transcendent? Is he relative in some regard? In classical theology, God is transcendent and absolute in that kind of sense. Whereas God in process theology is, at least by some people, seen to be more relative in that he's in a changing state in relation to his being, his creation. Number 8, another disagreement between theism and panentheism concerns the question whether God's omniscience is unqualified or restricted. We get to omniscience down the road in chapter 5. We'll look and see what does that mean and how is that to be understood. What are some objections to God knowing all things? What does it even mean to know all things? So an open theist will say God doesn't know the future, but he still knows all things that can be known. And since the future isn't a thing to be known, then that's not a mark against his omniscience. 9 is that traditional theism emphasizes God's role as efficient cause, whereas in process thought stresses God's role as a final cause. In other words, God, who is the goal or lure of the entire cosmic process, draws it to its final fulfillment. God is the final cause or telos of the world. But process theologians are wrong if they think it will be inconsistent for a theist to maintain that God is both the efficient cause and the final cause. So there's a distinction there between traditional theism, as God is the efficient cause for the world. Nash says here that process thought stresses God's role as final cause. Actually, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit. I think in Thomistic philosophy and theology, God is also the final cause. That the goal for everything is to be drawn to God in a certain way. Our final goal as human beings is to enjoy God's being and be in communion and fellowship with Him forever. So God is still a final cause in Thomistic thinking. And then number 10, in a sense, the foundation for most of the distinctive doctrines of process theology is its insistence that the monopolar notion of God is, just to paraphrase, wrong, and that God is more dipolar, meaning this active and passive pole that I was talking about earlier on. So there's an active pole where God just is, and already a state of actuality and being. And in the potentiality, God is actualizing more and more to become more and more perfect. That's the gist of what that means there for number 10. And then the final difference, number 11, between these two, Nash says, is their attitude to the question of God's ultimate triumph over evil. Simply put, theists generally think that God is going to triumph over evil. Nash here says that panentheists don't think that's possible because God really is not omnipotent in the sense that classical theists will claim. Now, he gives a list of several problems with process theology. What do you think some problems are? Well, one would be, where did everything in the universe? This is exactly what Nash is saying here. But where would everything come from if God isn't really the efficient cause and isn't really a creator? Then we have this problem of this eternal universe. That itself would seem to be a problem. Other issues that Nash brings up is that he sees this choice on the bottom of page 30. It says either Thomistic theism or panentheism. We have already seen this as a forced and artificial choice. Even if Thomistic theism is found unacceptable, panentheism is not the only alternative. So Nash sees these as itself two poles or two ends of a continuum, with classical theism on one hand and process theology on the other, and there being different schools of thought in between. And that's somewhat true, because I think that open theism and theistic personalism are not going to be as far as radical as process theology, but they are going to be in that direction. And they're all going to hold that God is composed of parts, not just actuality, but also potentiality, that he's changing, he's in time, he's passable. So they have all those things in common over against the classical Thomistic view that God is pure act, simple, not composed, not changing, timeless, and impassible. He's either of those things or he's not. So whether you're an open theist, a process theologian, or a theistic personalist, you can't maintain that God is somewhat changed. There are people who want to say, well, God doesn't change this way, but he changes in that way. But he does change. You can't say he's completely immutable and also say that he only changes somewhat. So either he's immutable or he isn't. So some theologians and philosophers will want to say, well, God's immutable in some ways, but not in others. Okay, but then he's not immutable in the strong sense, like the classical theologian thinks he is. So either he is or he isn't. It's like a woman being pregnant. She's either pregnant or she's not. So either God is pure act or he's not. Either God is simple or he's not. Either God is immutable or impassible or eternal, or he isn't. It's one or the other. I think Geisler was right here. It's either Thomism or some other version of something like process theology or panentheism, because either God is pure act or he's act with potentiality. And if he has potentiality, then he's changing, then he's passable, then he's in time, and he's ultimately not going to be the ultimate cause, first cause. Another problem that Nash brings up here is that process theology is also influenced by Greek thought. Almost any theology and philosophy can be seen to have some kind of roots in Greek thought. This is a problem with open theology as well, open theism. It's also anytime someone brings up an issue of classical theology like impassibility or simplicity, and someone says, well, that has roots in Greek thinking, therefore it's pagan and Christians shouldn't think that. You can take pretty much any view of God and have roots in Greek pagan thinking. Greek theology in the ancient world was not a uniform monolithic view. And you can pretty much point to Greek thinking. If you think God is eternal, then that can be Greek thinking. If you think he's in time, Greeks thought that too. You think God is pure spirit, Greeks thought that. If you think he is embodied, some Greeks thought that. If you think he's changing, Greeks thought that. If you think he's unchanging, Greeks thought that too. There is no monolithic view of God in ancient Greece. So to say that a view was wrong because it was held by the ancient Greeks is problematic for at least two reasons. One, because there just is no monolithic view. You can pretty much take any view and trace it back to Greece. Or rather, the second problem is that is a genetic fallacy, and a view is not wrong because of where it started from or what it has in common with previous thoughts. There's another problem regarding Scripture, Nash brings out on page 31, that the process theology has a lot of problems squaring itself with Scripture, because Scripture does not seem to indicate that the universe has always been here, for example. Rather, God is all-powerful and completely sovereign, and ultimately will triumph over evil, to give another example. It also has problems with other views of theology regarding, say, for example, the incarnation, the resurrection, the core of Christianity is problematic on a process theological, on a process view here. And there are these other problems, as I mentioned philosophically, about, well, how is God in a process of becoming? How, as Norman Geisler says in his quote here on page 33, how is God actualizing himself? We've already seen from the first way a few times ago in the argument for God's existence that something cannot actualize itself. It's got to be actualized by something else. How can the universe explain itself? How can it be accounted for? There's a lot of problems here with this process view. And so Nash also goes into a critique of the Thomistic view on page 35, but he doesn't go into a lot of detail here because he's going to critique these different attributes from a Thomistic model when he goes into each chapter, which I think is good, even though I don't agree with him. It's good because it'll help clarify what Thomists do and don't believe, and some of the objections I think will be cleared up along the way. So, for example, here he says that he quotes Norman Geisler, who was one of my professors in seminary, and says that basically the Thomistic view, he's trying to make Geisler out like he's critiquing the Thomistic view and saying that God has to be personal and relatable. And I just don't think that Dr. Geisler here meant that a Thomistic view precludes God being personal and relatable. So I don't think that's necessarily a critique of the Thomistic or classical view. You can be classical and hold that God is relatable and personal in a analogical sense. So we'll look at the Thomistic critiques as we go along these various attributes. And so we'll look at omnipotence next time in chapter 3. So we just kind of set the stage to actually have some fun next time, actually getting into the divine attributes. So I hope you'll tune in next time. Please like and subscribe and leave me a question or a comment. And thanks for tuning in.